There are few things more poisonous to suburban peace than a neighbor who treats your lawn like a public shortcut. For weeks, Karen Visor Lululemon perpetual power walk mode slashed across my front yard like she owned a shortcut to the mailbox. I tried being the reasonable neighbor, polite reminders, cute, please keep off the grass signs, even a decorative fence she could have stepped over like it was an Olympic hurdle. Nothing stuck. So when patience ran out and my pansies became sacrificial offerings, I cooked up a plan that was equal parts petty and theatrical, harmless powder mines, hidden beneath the sod, timed to explode in neon humiliation the moment an entitled foot pressed down. It wasn't about revenge for revenge's sake, it was about making trespassing feel inconvenient in a very colorful way. Before I tell you exactly how it went down, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is locally. I love seeing this story reach corners of the world. There's a quiet arrogance that comes with certain suburban routines, the kind wrapped in white sneakers, a visor, and a Bluetooth call that keeps time with your power walking cadence. In Pleasant View Heights, that arrogance had a name: Karen. 2 houses down 2 seconds faster if she cut the corner across my lawn. 2 seconds that over weeks became a small ritual of contempt for anything that wasn't asphalt or convenience. At first, I treated it like an awkward neighborly quirk. You don't assume malice the first time someone steps where you've planted pansies. You assume ignorance. So I walked across my own yard in sandals one Saturday morning, found her mid-diagonal stride, and said what any reasonable adult would: "Hey, could you please stick to the sidewalk? We're trying to get the grass to grow in that corner." She glanced at me the way someone glances at a fly, a shrug of entitlement, and said with that perfect suburban nonchalance, "It's just grass, Walter. It's faster this way." She kept walking. The pansies flattened like tiny surrender flags. You try politeness. You try signage. I bought one of those cute wooden "please keep off the grass" stakes with a smiling gnome on it and planted it right where her well-worn shortcut cut a diagonal through my lawn. The next morning the sign was gone. Not thrown into a ditch, not broken, gone. I saw it later face down under a mound of yard waste in her bin. Coincidence? Not really. So I went a step more: absurd, low decorative wire fencing, about a foot high, nothing ostentatious, more garden trim than barricade. The first time she approached it, she paused like a cat sizing up a jump, then lifted one perfectly sculpted Lululemon-clad leg over the wire, stepping delicately between the surviving pansies and continuing on her merry way. She didn't break stride. The fence became, if anything, an Olympic prop. By then the irritation had metastasized into obsession. Each fresh tread across my fescue felt like a deliberate message: my space, your convenience. I took the sensible route next and involved the HOA. Pleasant View Heights Association, an organization whose bylaws read like a prayer for neighborhood harmony and whose real talent was producing the exact same form letter in triplicate. "Dear Mr. Collins," the letter read. "Yes, my last name is Collins. Thank you for bringing your concerns to our attention. The association encourages neighborly communication to resolve property line disputes. While we remind all residents to respect private property, the association does not actively police pedestrian pathways unless significant property damage is documented. We suggest discussing the matter further with your neighbor." The formality of the phrasing suggested both training and placation and an enthusiasm for deflection. Discuss it further. I'd rather discuss meteorology with my microwave. Curiosity devolved into a flirtation with escalation. I called the non-emergency police line to ask about trespass. The dispatcher was patient and annoyingly correct. "Sir, unless she refuses to leave after being asked, or there's property damage or a no trespassing order in place, it's generally a civil matter. We can't station an officer to watch your lawn." The law lived in a different register than moral protest. Trespass in many jurisdictions is indeed a tricky business. You generally need permission withdrawn and refusal to leave, or explicit signage in some municipal codes. In other words, walking across short grass is rude. It is not necessarily illegal. The neighbors took sides in the quiet way neighborhoods do judgments, whispered over hedges, sympathetic nods from the elderly couple, 2 houses down an eye roll from the guy who practiced golf swings in his driveway at dawn. A few people laughed at my gnome saga. A couple of others offered practical suggestions: get a dog, plant thorny shrubs, buy a higher fence, which I considered with varying degrees of seriousness and acceptability. I didn't want to have a yard that read like a fortress. I wanted my lawn to be a lawn, not a no man's land. So I escalated in a way I thought would stay within the boundaries of petty creativity rather than civil war. I set up a motion sensor sprinkler. The idea was elegant in its simplicity, an automated, non-injurious inconvenience that could be positioned to give a one-off startling squirt to anyone daring enough to cross my turf. That lasted about 2 days before Karen marched to the HOA office to complain that I'd soaked her shoes, and the HOA sent me a warning for water nuisance. Apparently there are bylaws for everything, even passive-aggressive irrigation. At this point, my options narrowed to a few unsavory ones: get aggressive and risk real legal trouble, or get creative and risk being petty enough to be talked about at book club. I wanted something that would register as consequence without causing harm, something that would announce to anyone contemplating trespass that actions have repercussions, and not in the form of passive lecture but rather inconvenient, unmistakable experience. There's an odd thing about being pushed repeatedly that sharpens your imagination. When you're repeatedly dismissed by a neighbor who believes the rules are optional, problem-solving ceases to be abstract and becomes a series of experiments. Each failed tactic, the sign, the fence, the sprinkler, taught me a bit more about what worked emotionally and what didn't. The goal wasn't to punish, it was to create a proportional, memorable repercussion that left no lasting damage but severe embarrassment and inconvenience. So I began to sketch out a plan that felt theatrical, in the same way a prank on a late-night show is theatrical, harmless, visible, and humbling. Something loud in its message, but soft in its physicality. A consequence that would not put anyone in the hospital but would certainly make them think twice before treading where they weren't welcome. It wasn't a plan I told anyone about. It lived in the margins of my notebooks and the late-night searches that are best not admitted in polite company. It was petty, maybe a little insane, and undeniably tempting. That's where the story of color begins, not with rage, not with violence, but with the absurd idea that a blast of bright washable powder could be the suburban equivalent of a sternly worded legal notice. It is funny how quickly dignity collapses when your white sneakers bloom pink. I started cataloging my failures like a frustrated scientist catalogs bad experiments, each one a lesson wrapped in humiliation. The polite stuff first, because that's what decent people do. You talk, you ask, you assume ignorance. The first time I confronted Karen, I actually tried to be neighborly. I walked out in my flip-flops, palms full of mulch, in the faint hope that a human conversation would diffuse the situation. "Hey, Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice breezy. "Could you please use the sidewalk? I'm trying to get the grass to grow in that corner." She looked at me like I'd interrupted an important phone call. "It's just grass, Walter," she said, smiling. That infuriating suburban smile you see in real estate brochures. "It's faster this way." And she kept walking, as if I'd asked her to step around a puddle instead of treating someone else's lawn like an express lane. Those first few incidents I could almost forgive. People trip up, people don't notice. But it turned into a pattern so deliberate it felt performative. The path across my yard was worn by her heels in a perfect diagonal, as if she were plotting geometry lessons with every stride. So I escalated incrementally, because escalation in my mind still had to be tasteful. I bought one of those wooden gnome signs, whimsical, neighborly, the kind you'd see in a gardening blog. "Please keep off the grass," it said, with a cartoon gnome tipping his hat. The sign lasted 2 days. Then it didn't. I later found it face down in a pile of yard waste at Karen's curb. She'd removed it with her own hands. I was flabbergasted. It was petty, and yet oddly intimate, a direct message that my boundaries didn't matter. So I tried a fence. Not a full fence, not anything that would require a permit, just a low decorative border wire with little curves a foot high. It was a ridiculous, almost comical barrier, the suburban equivalent of a "do not cross" tape at a kid's birthday party. I imagined her doing the walk of shame around it, a tiny, dignified detour. What happened instead was like a scene from a lifestyle magazine where athletic casual wear meets suburban rebellion. She paused, assessed, then gracefully lifted a Lululemon-clad leg over the wire and stepped between my pansies as if performing some perfectly rehearsed leap. She didn't even look like she'd broken a sweat. The fence became a prop in her morning routine. Those two humiliations, the stolen gnome and the gymnastic leap, began to tweak something in me. The neighborhood effect set in gossip, raised eyebrows, a few sympathetic glances from the retired couple down the street who liked to water their hostas at dusk. People started offering suggestions between sips of coffee and over hedges. "Get a dog," someone said, with the authority of someone who'd never owned a dog. "Plant thorny shrubs," another offered, imagining a Gothic border of barbs. "Higher fence," said the man who apparently thought zoning permits were mere suggestions. Each solution, when you looked at it, introduced new complications. HOA rules about fence heights, potential fines for aggressive landscaping, the moral question of weaponizing plants. I even entertained the idea of a large dog. My friend Dave, who bless him, believed that all neighbor problems could be solved by either a big grin or a big animal, suggested a mastiff with a liking for boundary patrol. But the HOA has opinions, and those opinions frequently translate to penalties. In our little association's covenants, there was a clause about reasonable and non-intimidating pet keeping. There's a civic euphemism for bring a Rottweiler, and the HOA will bring a fine. I didn't want to turn my lawn into a fortress or risk becoming the neighborhood spectacle for all the wrong reasons. The last thing I needed was to be the guy who'd been served a notice about intimidating canine presence. So I pivoted to non-confrontational deterrence. Motion-activated sprinklers seemed like a good compromise, startling but non-harmful, public enough to register as consequence without involving law enforcement. I bought a couple, set them up along the little diagonal, and felt a modest surge of satisfaction. Imagine my delight the first time Karen stepped onto the turf and got a polite squirt. I half expected her to make a theatrical gasp and then march off, soaked and shamefaced. Instead, she stormed to the HOA office with that mix of righteous indignation and the ability to dial numbers with a fury I can only describe as preternatural. The HOA replied within 48 hours with a gentle bureaucratic scolding. "Please avoid actions that cause nuisance to neighboring properties," they wrote. The letter was odd. Who exactly was being inconvenienced? The soaked trespasser or the lawn owner who'd been repeatedly walked on? But the HOA cited water usage and nuisance complaints, and suddenly I had a warning on my account about improper use of irrigation to disturb other residents. That was the day I learned how thin the line is between defense and nuisance in HOA speak. The community covenants are a delicate lattice of norms, and once you poke a hole in one spot, the enforcement machinery hums into life. The irony was delicious and expensive. The HOA's response was a boxed empathy wrapped in a threat of fines. They enforced aesthetics with the ferocity of an art gallery curator. When bureaucracy proved to be as useful as a paper umbrella in a thunderstorm, I sought counsel. I called a nonchalant, competent lawyer, not to sue, but to ask, what are my rights? If someone repeatedly crosses my property, legal counsel blessed their balance sheets, gave me the expected answer. Trespass laws depend heavily on jurisdiction, but generally repeated entry after being explicitly told not to constitutes a civil trespass. However, proving damages is the sticky part. Wear on the lawn might count, but you'd need documentation, dated photos, witness statements, or more egregious evidence like a magnet for petty lawsuits. The lawyer also cautioned about retaliatory measures causing a nuisance could place me on the hook for liability if someone were injured. In other words, the law tends to side with de-escalation. Knowing the legal contours only sharpened my creativity. I wasn't interested in a legal battle, I was interested in deterrence. My thought process moved from how do I punish to how do I create an experience so inconvenient it rewrites habit. The answer needed to be proportionate, safe, but memorable. I spent nights researching the kinds of harmless but dramatic materials used in color runs and theatrical productions. Cornstarch, food-grade dyes, plant-based pigments, all touted as non-toxic and biodegradable. The research had a strange, giddy quality to it. It was the kind of thing you don't mention at family dinners. What would startle someone enough to make them reconsider stepping on my lawn but not cause real harm? Color. Attention-grabbing, washable color that announces trespassing in neon. I kept a messy notebook filled with sketches and lists the kind of chaotic engineering that starts with the words, "what if?" I listed pros and cons to each idea: sensors, pressure plates, spring triggers, compressed air puffers. I cross-referenced each mechanical possibility with safety concerns. No projectiles, no liquids that stain permanently, no explosions, nothing that would land me in criminal court. The balance was delicate, effective humiliation without real injury. Friends, when I told them, vacillated between amused and aghast. Dave predictably loved it. He called it performance art. Others cautioned me about escalation, reputational damage, and the small army of people who love to judge other people's petty wars on community message boards. But the thought of Karen, immaculate in white leggings, pausing mid-stride and blinking pink powder from her lashes, kept me awake in the best, most absurd way. So I built prototypes in my garage, late at night, a kind of suburban MacGyver in shorts and an old college t-shirt. Springs plastic tubs, thin plywood pressure plates. I tested release mechanisms in empty parking lots and on inert grass, measuring puff heights and dispersal patterns, making sure the clouds would be dramatic but localized. Each successful test gave me a private thrill. Each failure taught me refinement. The goal wasn't to humiliate gratuitously. It was to shift behavior using the language of embarrassment rather than the blunt instrument of force. At some point, petty necessity curdled into art. The neighborhood's small cruelties had become my medium, and the experiment felt eerily like a civic performance meant to correct a tiny injustice. The more I refined the plan, the more it seemed inevitable. If signage fence and HOA bureaucracy couldn't do it, maybe humiliation, temporary, colorful, and conspicuously non-harmful, just might. I remember the exact moment the plan hardened from a late-night fantasy into a practical project. It was somewhere between midnight and the kind of small hours where the internet becomes a confessional for half-baked schemes. I had a pile of tabs open: holy powder non-toxic cornstarch dye recipes, pressure plate trigger, DIY, and small CO2 cartridge safety. The more I read, the more the idea felt less like mischief and more like an engineering problem with a moral constraint: make it humiliating, not harmful. Designing the devices was an exercise in suburban MacGyverism. I sketched out a cross-section on the back of an old HOA violation. Notice a shallow plastic container, maybe the kind used for deli takeout, buried just under the sod. Inside, a generous scoop of powdered food-grade cornstarch colored with plant-based dyes, bright hyperbolic colors that would stain fabric for an afternoon but wash out. On top of that, a thin pressure plate, a little square of plywood or hard plastic, balanced so that a normal step would depress it. The trigger itself could be as simple as a spring-loaded striker, or for a cleaner puff, a tiny CO2 cartridge punctured by a pin when the pressure plate collapsed, releasing a controlled burst of air that would force the powder up into the lower leg area. No projectiles, no shrapnel, no liquids that would permanently ruin clothing, just a puff of theatrical color. Safety was my first and last caveat. If anyone got hurt because I wanted to win a petty turf war, there would be no winning. I rechecked sources. The cornstarch formulations used in color runs are widely advertised as non-toxic and biodegradable. CO2 cartridges are common, small, and used in paintball and bike pumps. If handled properly, they pose low risk. Still, I educated myself on accidental inhalation risks and made sure the powder would be coarse enough to avoid fine particulates that could be inhaled deeply. I cross-referenced municipal codes for airborne particulate matter and read city environmental guidelines until I was convinced that a handful of non-toxic powder used in a localized puff was unlikely to trigger a pollution complaint, though I knew the HOA would find a way to complain about anything. As for the mechanics, it took a couple of evenings in my garage. I scavenged springs from old toys, bought thin plywood sheets and plastic tubs, and ordered bulk packs of those neon powders marketed for color runs. I experimented with template pressure plates, adjusting the tension so an adult footstep of average weight would trigger, but a passing breeze or small animal would not. I tested different cartridge release angles to keep the powder plume directed upward and inward. The goal was an unmistakable cloud around a person's lower leg, not a lawn-wide dust storm. I wasn't stupid about the optics. The last thing I needed was to be the guy caught on neighborhood cameras fiddling with holes in his lawn wearing a headlamp. That's where Mudslide Mike came in. Mike was a landscaper who worked down the block, the sort of blunt, weathered character who smelled of diesel and had a friendly, practical face. He knew soil like other people know their mother tongues. He'd been doing odd jobs for neighbors for years, turning yards into magazine-ready plots and coming with a cautionary tale or two about HOA inspections. When I approached him, I framed the request as gardening maintenance with plausible deniability. "Hey, Mike," I said casually as he rolled his wheelbarrow past my driveway one afternoon. "You got a minute? I'm thinking of aerating that narrow strip that keeps compaction from my path. Can you do a quick run along there? Frankly, I bought these experimental soil sensors that I'd like popped in while you're at it: moisture, pH, the usual snoopery." Mike squinted at the plastic things I produced, little sealed cylinders that on the outside looked sensorish. I kept my movements nonchalant, the way a person who does not have a conspiracy should act. He laughed. "Experimental sensors, you buying them on the internet, Walt?" He took one and turned it over. "Looks fishy, but I can pop 'em in with the aeration. Less work than explaining to Brenda at the HOA why your grass is half up." He never asked too many questions. That was part of Mike's virtue or his flaw. Contractors often prefer plausible work that pays the bills without getting into neighborly drama. I handed him cash in a small envelope, because I knew apologies come cheaper than lawyers, and because I was afraid the sanitized language of censors would fall apart under interrogation. He nodded, took the envelope with a grunt, and assured me he'd be by the next day to run his aerator along the strip. That night I prepared the devices. I labeled each container with a small colored sticker so I could keep track of them later: magenta, cerulean lime, tangerine violet, and a ridiculous fluorescent yellow for variety. I tested each trigger in the garage, measuring the puff height with a yardstick and sweeping the residual dust with a shop vac to avoid painting my own floor in neon. The rhythm of the work, gluing, fitting springs, sealing lids, was oddly meditative. There's a strange satisfaction in constructing something tidy and mechanical. It makes you feel for a moment like a competent person solving a problem. Mike and his crew arrived early the next morning. They did the aeration with that industrious efficiency of men who have spent their lives moving dirt around. I kept my hands in my pockets, saying things like, "Yeah, loosen the soil there, would you?" while Mike and his helper dug small holes, popped in sensors, and tamped the turf back down. He did not question the fact that the sensor looked suspiciously light and emitted no blinking LED. He simply did the job he'd been paid to do. I watched from the kitchen window, heart staccato and curious. After they left, the lawn looked untouched, no obvious mounds, no sign of disturbance. Mike did his work cleanly, the sod replaced so seamlessly that the path looked like it had always been that way. I had 6 little devices buried along the diagonal, each under a patch of grass, thinly disguising a colorful secret. I felt both triumphant and faintly ridiculous. The devices sat like tiny time bombs of embarrassment, inert and utterly harmless, unless engaged by the weight of an entitled stride. That afternoon, I went about my life in the small, nervous way people do when they are carrying a secret that could blow up in their faces. I walked the dog at the usual hour, though I don't own a dog that was part of the weirdness, mowed an area away from the secret line, and rehearsed my lines for the eventual confrontation in the mirror. I told myself I was doing a civic service, deterring trespass, protecting my pansies, enforcing boundaries that polite society apparently no longer respects. And then I waited. Anticipation has its own delicious cruelty. It taunts you with possibilities. What if she doesn't fall for it? What if someone else triggers a device? What if it rains and the powder becomes a clause in my own undoing? Still, the potential payoff, the thought of a perfectly timed cascade of colors broadcasting the message, "Don't walk here," felt worth the risk. I reminded myself of the legal counsel, avoid harm show, proportionality document, everything. I charged my phone and I kept my curtains partway open. Night fell, and with it, a small, ridiculous serenity. The devices breathed under the sod like sleeping non-lethal beasts. In the quiet of my kitchen, I imagined the colors, the shocked expression, the dropped phone. I told myself with the kind of self-assurance that only a person about to perform a petty act can muster, that sometimes the only language an entitled neighbor understands is consequence painted in neon. The morning of the execution, and yes, it felt theatrical to call it, that arrived with the kind of crisp light that makes suburban lawns glisten like magazine spreads. I brewed coffee as if I were serenely preparing for a Sunday ritual, though my hands betrayed me with a slight tremor. I kept the blinds half open, an architectural compromise that allowed me a good view of the diagonal while preserving the illusion that I was merely watering my dignity with caffeine, not plotting a petty revolution. Karen's schedule was as steady as a metronome. She power-walked at approximately 3:15 p.m. every day, visor down, earbuds, or a phone conversation propelling each stride. Her routine was one of the unfortunate conveniences of living near someone who turned punctuality into an athletic discipline. I knew the cadence of her steps, the precise angles of her path, and more intimately than I cared to admit, the way her right heel nicked the same tuft of grass every other morning. If predictability is the enemy of security, it is the friend of mischief. I did a final check on the devices just after noon. Nothing to see, nothing to hear. The sod lay flat, the grass blades swayed in a mild breeze, and my 6 little capsules slept beneath each, labeled in my head with their colors. I set my phone on silent and left it by the window with the camera app loaded. Not because I wanted to gloat later, though privately I hoped for at least a few candid images, but because documentation felt prudent. If things went sideways, evidence would be useful to defend my choices in HOA paperwork or, heaven forbid, small claims court. As the appointed hour approached, my heart tightened and loosened in uneven rhythms. There's a certain shameful joy in anticipation when the outcome is humiliation for someone who's been inflicting it. It is a taste both illicit and oddly savory. I took my position by the curtain breath, shallow eyes fixed. The world outside continued in its suburban orbit. Mail trucks idled. A teenager on a skateboard zipped past 2 houses over. The retired couple across the street were out trimming boxwoods, glancing my way with that look that could mean anything from mild disapproval to amusement. And then she appeared. Karen emerged like clockwork, phone at her ear, a half-smile of someone who thinks the world is conspiring in her favor. Her white leggings pristine, the sort of breathable fabric that costs enough to make a grown man wince, caught the sunlight. For a moment, she was the image of suburban, athletic perfection, and for a sliver of warped vanity, I admired the dedication that took her to this absurd ritual. Her foot left the sidewalk and descended onto my grass. The moment was simple, mundane, the sort of step people take 1,000 times a day without consequence. Then the first device answered. There was a soft mechanical sigh, a brief click, like a small creature, exhaling, and then, poof, a sharp theatrical cloud of magenta shot upward. It wrapped around her lower leg in a blossom of color, and for an instant, she looked like a statue in the middle of a paint-stained confetti storm. She stopped. Mid-sentence. Her voice cut off into the phone in a poor, flustered sputter. Her hand flew down to her ankle, then clapped instinctively to her mouth, as if some private part of her had been exposed in broad daylight. The expression on her face moved through stages: confusion, denial, outrage, the unmistakable dawning of humiliation. She took another step, perhaps intending to retreat, perhaps intending to get to the sidewalk faster. Her other foot found the second trigger. Poof, electric blue, a cloud that puffed like a startled dove and clung to the fabric in sympathetic swaths. Now both legs were stained magenta on one, cerulean on the other, like two flags raised in the theater of petty warfare. She yelped a high, shocked sound and dropped her phone on the grass. The phone skidded and clattered as if the universe had finally decided to introduce props to my little scene. And there it was, the private triumph I'd rehearsed alone in my kitchen, now unfolding in luminous absurdity. The third device tripped when she stepped sideways in panic, a lime-green plume that added a third stripe to her accidental palette. Her hair was still immaculate, but strips of color dusted her eyelashes and the rim of her visor. For a moment, she looked like a Jackson Pollock reject who'd accidentally stumbled into Sunday brunch. She spun around and looked up at my window, eyes wide and furious. For the first time, she was no longer a blur across the grass. She was a target of my laughter, my experiment, my revenge. I did stupidly let out a small, involuntary chuckle. It escaped me like steam from a kettle, and the look she gave me made me feel both like a victorious general and a man who'd just been caught sneaking cookies. Her expression metastasized instantly into righteous fury. Powdered fingers pointed at my house as if accusing me in the court of weather. "Walter," she shrieked, and the sound carried down the street with that dramatic cadence of someone who believes the gods of outrage have chosen them as a vessel. She stomped toward the porch each step, leaving little rainbow puffs like footsteps from some prankster fairy tale. Neighbors peeked over hedges. The man across the street stopped mid-weed. Someone in a passing pickup slowed, craned his neck, and then kept going, likely assuming it was one of those suburban dramas that makes for good coffee talk later. By the time she reached my front steps, the spectacle had acquired witnesses. I opened the door on purpose, put on my most innocent face, and said the thing I had practiced earlier. "Good heavens, what happened? Did you get into a fight with a rainbow?" My tone was equal parts concern and mischief, a verbal shrug that said, "I am sorry you are embarrassed, but objectively, this is astonishing." She pointed at me like a thunderbolt. "You did this," she accused, bright neon dust flecking her teeth. "You booby-trapped your lawn. You attacked me." Her voice quivered with an outrage practiced by phone calls and HOA reports. The street seemed to tilt toward her, ready to supply the gallows if necessary. Her phone, which she'd scooped back up like a talisman, blinked with missed calls. I tried the performance of baffled innocence because I had invested in the role. "Me," I said, palms raised. "Karen lawns don't attack. You must have run through someone else's color run," or I offered my best blank expression, the kind politicians try to wear when they want to both deny and deflect. The absurdity of the situation made it hard to be entirely convincing, but I'd hoped the kettle had already boiled, and it was time for her to taste the steam. She was not placated. She stamped and shouted and threatened to call the HOA, the police, perhaps even the environmental agency, as if neon cornstarch were a weapon of mass contamination. Her breath came hard. Her neighbors glanced at me with expressions that read like scanned headlines, some amused, some horrified, a handful pleased that the invader had been humiliated at last. Within minutes, the street filled with a buzz. People whispered phones were up, and for perhaps the first time since this little war began, Karen's shortcut had become a spectacle rather than a convenience. She stomped back to her house, leaving a trail of magenta and blue footprints behind her, and I stood for a moment on my stoop and watched the rainbow fade into the fabric of the neighborhood. The chest-tightening joy I felt was immediate and complicated. I had won in the narrowest, most petty sense imaginable, but the cost in adrenaline and in the risk of escalation was a new weight to carry. As she slammed her door, I realized the moment of truth would come soon enough. The HOA, the calls, the official letters. Triumph, however, satisfying, is rarely quiet in a place where neighbors know where you get your lawnmower serviced. For now, though, there was private victory in the improbable image of Karen, an icon of entitlement, walking back with neon streaked down her leggings like a flag of embarrassment. I let myself smile, and then quietly closed the door. The fallout began almost before the last particles of neon powder had drifted from the air. Karen, of course, wasted no time. Within minutes, I could hear the muffled sound of her voice leaking from her house as she phoned anyone who would listen. It was a chorus of outrage. The HOA, the police, her sister in Arizona, probably the Centers for Disease Control, if she could find the number. I imagined the conversations vividly. He assaulted me with exploding chemicals. My white leggings are ruined. This is a hostile act. She had that remarkable suburban skill of transforming minor inconveniences into 5-alarm emergencies. I barely had time to make myself a sandwich before my phone buzzed. It was Brenda from the HOA office, the long-suffering manager who had the voice of a woman who had read too many bylaws and not enough novels. "Mr. Collins," she said, each syllable tight with exasperation, "we've received a very troubling call from your neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker." Yes, Karen's real last name was Whitaker, though nobody in the neighborhood ever called her anything but Karen. "She's alleging that your property is booby-trapped," Brenda continued, and I could practically hear the air quotes. "Explosions of powder, hazardous materials. She's demanding we issue citations immediately." I summoned my calmest, most incredulous tone. "Brenda, I don't know what Karen is talking about. She did stop by, earlier covered in some strange colored dust, yes. I thought maybe she'd been at one of those charity fun runs, or perhaps a child's birthday party with piñatas. I suggested it might be pollen. Certain fungi are brightly colored, you know." There was a long sigh on the line, the kind of sigh that belongs to someone who suspects they're being lied to but lacks the stamina to prove it. "Walter," she said finally, "just expect some notices in the mail." And arrive they did, a rainbow of violation letters. Violation creation of a public nuisance. Violation use of unapproved subsurface landscaping devices. Violation application of non-approved ground cover, multi-hued powder. Violation potential environmental contamination via unknown airborne substances. My personal favorite, violation installation of prohibited booby traps. I laughed out loud when I read that one. The HOA apparently had a bylaw specifically banning booby traps. I wondered what long-forgotten feud had necessitated that clause. But Karen wasn't content with HOA bureaucracy. The very next day, a patrol car pulled up in front of my house. 2 officers stepped out, one middle-aged with the weary eyes of a man who had dealt with suburban nonsense too many times, and a younger one still green enough to think every call might turn into a movie scene. They walked up my drive with the reluctant gait of men who already knew this was going to be stupid. "Mr. Collins," the older officer asked, "we had a call from your neighbor, Mrs. Whitaker. She claims you've set up back devices on your lawn, devices that explode colored powder." I raised an eyebrow, playing innocent. "Explosions, officers. It's cornstarch and food coloring. Perfectly harmless. No fire, no chemicals, no danger. If you'd like, I can show you exactly how one works." I gestured toward the lawn with a theatrical flourish. The younger officer perked up. "You mean like a demonstration?" His eyes lit up the way kids' eyes do when they hear the word fireworks. The older one shot him a look that said, "Don't encourage this man." Then he turned back to me. "Look, Walter, technically what you've described doesn't sound like assault. It's not a weapon, it's not flammable, it's not even permanent. But rigging any kind of device on your property carries risks. What if the mail carrier walked across? What if a child triggered it? Someone could trip, fall, break an arm. That's liability for you." I nodded gravely as though I were attending a legal seminar. "I understand, officer. I only installed them because she's been trespassing daily after repeated polite requests to stop. There comes a point when you have to get creative." From her porch, Karen watched the exchange with folded arms still blotched in faint streaks of magenta and lime that even vigorous scrubbing hadn't entirely removed. She was practically vibrating with fury, certain the police would haul me away in handcuffs. When they didn't, her voice cracked the air like a whip. "He attacked me. This is an assault. You're just going to let him get away with this." The older officer turned his patience at its limit. "Ma'am, we've advised you before about trespassing. If you continue to enter Mr. Collins's property after being warned, you could be cited. Please just use the sidewalk." It was the only time I'd ever seen Karen silenced, if only for a heartbeat. She sputtered, opened her mouth, then shut it again, retreating into her house like a dragon denied its flame. The police left me with a warning about liability, but no charges. Karen was left with nothing but indignation, but the story was far from over. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than pollen in spring. Children whispered about the exploding rainbow lawn. Teenagers dared each other to sprint across like running some suburban gauntlet. Parents clucked in disapproval while secretly fighting smirks. Even the HOA board members I suspected were privately amused, though they'd never admit it. But Karen wasn't done. She sent a letter through a lawyer, demanding compensation for emotional distress, property damage to clothing and footwear, and humiliation in front of peers. My own lawyer, a pragmatic woman with a taste for irony, drafted a response, pointing out her repeated trespass, citing local civil statutes, and suggesting she purchase washable sneakers. The whole ordeal began to feel less like a neighborly dispute and more like a low-budget courtroom drama played out on manicured lawns. The HOA kept piling fines onto my account. Karen paraded her stained leggings at every possible social gathering, holding them up like bloody evidence at a crime scene. And me, I maintained my innocence, all while mowing around my devices with surgical precision, careful never to step on the line of triggers myself. Yet behind the humor and pettiness tension coiled tight. The police warning echoed in my head: civil liability. I knew that one bad accident, a child, a delivery driver, anyone but Karen, could shift the entire narrative from colorful justice to reckless negligence. At night, I found myself staring out the window at the diagonal, listening to the cicadas, wondering if I'd gone too far. But then I'd remember the smug tilt of Karen's head, the way she dismissed me with, "It's just grass, Walter," as if my lawn were public property. And I'd smile just a little. Because for once, the trespass had consequences painted across her pristine yoga gear in blazing neon. And for a brief, glorious week, Karen did not set foot on my grass. The strange thing about victory is how quickly it sours. At first, I was elated. Karen avoided my lawn like it was radioactive. She made these exaggerated detours, stepping off the sidewalk and into the street just to ensure no part of her precious sneakers grazed my grass. Her dog, a yappy little terrier named Fifi, seemed to catch the paranoia too, tugging on the leash whenever they neared my property, as if even animals sense humiliation lingers in the soil. For a moment, I thought I'd finally achieved suburban peace. But peace in Pleasant View Heights has the shelf life of a ripe avocado. The HOA's notices began piling up like overdue bills. Every day, my mailbox was stuffed with pastel-colored envelopes carrying bureaucratic accusations. Violation, creation of airborne particulate matter. Violation unauthorized soil modifications. Violation hazardous materials in common airspace. That last one made me laugh out loud. My cornstarch mines were apparently a danger to the ozone layer now. Still, each envelope carried weight. The fines were not symbolic, they were financial battering rams. $50 for public nuisance. $100 for installation of unapproved landscaping devices. Another $200 for aesthetic disruption of community cohesion. Brenda from the HOA office left me a voicemail that dripped with weary sympathy. "Walter, look between you and me, the board is under pressure. Karen's very loud. If you don't at least appear to comply, these fines could escalate into liens. Please don't make me the villain here." I called my lawyer. Her voice was sharp, professional, laced with the kind of dry humor only a career in property disputes can carve. "You've created a liability minefield, Walter," she said. "Yes, Karen was trespassing. Yes, you warned her. But the minute you rigged a device, even a harmless one, you opened yourself to claims. If some delivery guy had tripped, or if Karen had pretended to be injured, you'd be defending yourself in civil court right now." I paced the kitchen as she spoke, staring out at the lawn where the diagonal still cut faintly across the grass. "But it worked," I protested. She finally stopped. She sighed. "Sometimes effectiveness and legality are different universes. What's your endgame here? To win the battle of neon leggings, or to keep your property safe without bankrupting yourself?" It was a fair point, though. I hated conceding it. Yet pride is a stubborn animal. I wasn't ready to surrender my rainbow gauntlet. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. She printed out photographs of her stained clothes and paraded them like exhibits in a trial. She waved them at neighbors, at book club, even at the postman. She told anyone who would listen that she had been attacked on her own street, a victim of what she melodramatically called chemical warfare. The absurdity would have been hilarious if the HOA board hadn't started to take her side, citing potential risk to community reputation. The police visit hadn't helped either. Though they'd left without pressing charges, their words about liability rattled around my skull like loose change. What if? What if a child decided to test the rumors and dart across the diagonal? What if the mail carrier cut the corner to save a second and ended up coughing in lime green dust? My mind supplied scenarios in which I was no longer the clever prankster, but the neighborhood menace. That didn't stop me from savoring the gossip. Neighbors whispered in low tones at block parties. Some called me a genius, others called me insane. A few thought both things could be true at once. Kids gave each other dares. Run across Collins's lawn, see if you come out purple. I even overheard one teenager compare it to a video game checkpoint. If you make it through, you level up. That part unsettled me. I hadn't created deterrence. I'd created an attraction. One evening, I caught sight of two boys loitering near my yard, their bikes thrown carelessly on the curb. They whispered, giggled, then made a dash for it. My heart leapt to my throat. One boy made it across without triggering a mine, but the other miscalculated, stepping squarely on the violet charge. Poof, his jeans bloomed purple. The boy shrieked, half in laughter, half in panic, and they both tore off down the street, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. That was the moment the thrill turned sour. Suddenly, I wasn't the victim turning the tables. I was the adult who'd armed his lawn with contraptions that kids thought were toys. The next day, another HOA letter arrived, this one stamped urgent. They demanded immediate removal of all subsurface devices and restoration of aesthetic harmony. They also threatened escalating fines, including the possibility of placing a lien on my property. It was no longer a game. I sat at the kitchen table, letters fanned out like a losing hand of cards, and felt the weight of it. The petty triumph had been sweet, but now it tasted of stress, legal jargon, and looming debt. Even Dave, my cheerleader friend, who had originally suggested something messy, shook his head when I told him about the kids. Dude, this has officially crossed into too much. Yet part of me still resisted. Why should Karen win? Why should her entitlement dictate the terms? Wasn't this exactly the problem, people like her trampling boundaries, both literal and metaphorical, until you had no choice but to resist? But another voice, quieter and more rational, whispered that the point had already been made. Karen had stopped trespassing. Neighbors had seen her humiliated. The message was out. Keeping the mines in place was no longer necessary, it was reckless. I stood at the window that night watching the diagonal under moonlight. The grass had grown uneven where the devices were buried, subtle lumps betraying the hidden mechanics below. I imagined digging them up, disarming them like some suburban bomb squad. I imagined the relief of sending Brenda an email saying, "The sensors are gone, the soil is clean." And then I imagined Karen Visor back in place, striding across again with smug triumph, and my stomach clenched. Could I stomach seeing her reclaim that diagonal? Could I let her believe she'd won? It was a war between pride and peace, and I knew sooner or later one would have to surrender. The week after the kids' purple jeans incident, the whole neighborhood buzzed like someone had lit a bonfire under Pleasant View Heights. Every conversation, whether whispered over hedges, muttered while pulling trash bins to the curb, or shouted across the community pool fence, seemed to orbit around one topic: my lawn. Some neighbors thought it was brilliant justice. Others believed I'd become the local lunatic arming suburban landmines. Karen, of course, took center stage in this theater. She marched door to door with a folder stuffed full of photographs, her stained leggings, her dog's leash dusted in neon green, her porch smeared with faint magenta footprints. She wielded those photos like sacred relics of martyrdom, declaring she had been assaulted with toxic chemicals. Never mind that the ingredients list read like a recipe for carnival snacks. She made it sound like I'd unleashed mustard gas. The HOA meetings turned into battlegrounds. I attended one foolishly thinking I could defend myself. As soon as I entered the clubhouse, heads swiveled, whispers flared, and Karen pounced. "There he is," she cried, pointing at me as if she'd spotted a war criminal. The man who turned Pleasant View Heights into a hazardous zone. I tried to keep calm even as sweat prickled under my collar. With respect, I said all I did was defend my property after months of trespass. Mrs. Whitaker ignored signs, fences, polite requests, and even HOA warnings. The powder was harmless. Color run organizers use it on children, but the board was more interested in the politics of appearances. Mr. Collins, Brenda said, her voice carefully neutral. Regardless of intent, your actions have created controversy. The HOA's responsibility is to maintain community harmony. We can't condone devices hidden under lawns, even if technically harmless. Karen's smirked arms folded as though she'd just won a championship match. You see, even the board agrees this was reckless. I wanted to shout that she'd brought it all on herself, but shouting in HOA meetings is like arguing with a vending machine. You may hit the buttons harder, but you won't get your candy bar any faster. Back home, the fines kept rolling in. They multiplied like weeds, 50 here, 100 there, late fees stacking like bricks on my chest. My lawyer warned me that if I didn't resolve the issue soon, the HOA could file a lien against my house. The word lien landed like a stone in my stomach. It wasn't just money. It was ownership leverage, the threat that my home, my sanctuary, could become collateral in a war over neon powder. Meanwhile, the neighborhood kids continued their dares. They turned my lawn into an obstacle course, a suburban legend. I spotted chalk markings on the sidewalk, danger color zone. At night, I heard giggles outside my window, followed by muffled poofs of powder. It was only a matter of time before a parent complained not about Karen, but about me. The stress grew heavier by the day. Mowing the grass became a minefield, literally. I tiptoed around the buried devices, terrified of setting one off myself. Even watering felt dangerous. One wrong step and I'd be coated in my own rainbow justice. My chest tightened every time the mail carrier walked too close to the diagonal. I caught myself praying he'd stick to the sidewalk as though divine intervention should be dispatched for mail delivery. I tried reasoning with Karen one last time. I caught her on the street visor gleaming, still striding like a general. "Karen," I said, forcing civility into my voice, "let's be adults. If you stop trespassing, I'll dismantle the devices. We can both move on." She barked out a laugh sharp enough to cut glass. "You dismantle them or I'll have the HOA bankrupt you. Either way, Walter, you lose." The smugness in her tone nearly pushed me over the edge. For a moment I pictured doubling down more devices, brighter powder, maybe even motion sensors that played circus music. But the rational part of me, the part my lawyer had carefully nurtured, reminded me that escalation would only lead to disaster. That night, lying awake, I thought about all the absurdity. My entire summer had been consumed by a footpath. Neighbors now defined me not as Walter Collins' homeowner, but as the guy with the exploding lawn. I hadn't created peace. I'd created spectacle. And spectacle, unlike grass, does not fade quietly. The pressure became unbearable when I received a certified letter from the City Code Enforcement Office. They'd been contacted about potential interference with underground utilities. The idea that my tiny powder containers could threaten gas lines was ludicrous, but bureaucracies thrive on ludicrous. The letter demanded either proof of compliance or removal of subsurface alterations. Failure to comply could lead to fines far greater than the HOA's municipal fines, the kind that stack into thousands. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the letter while the pile of HOA violations loomed like a neon mountain. My chest felt hollow. Was this what victory looked like? Karen still strutted around the neighborhood, brandishing photos of her humiliation like trophies. The HOA treated me like a delinquent. The city was now sniffing around. And my lawn, once a quiet patch of green, had become a stage for gossip, laughter, and potential lawsuits. It was clear the war had to end. But surrender is complicated when pride has been your general. A part of me wanted to hold on to resist until the bitter end. Another part, the exhausted rational part, knew that keeping the devices in place was no longer clever, just reckless. I poured myself a drink and stood at the window, looking out at the faint diagonal where the grass refused to grow. The moonlight made the path glow like a scar. For weeks that scar had defined me. And for weeks I'd convinced myself that defending it at any cost was noble. But maybe nobility wasn't neon humiliation. Maybe it was the quiet dignity of letting go. Tomorrow night I decided under cover of darkness the mines would come out. But even as I made the decision, I couldn't help but imagine the final insult Karen's face if she realized I'd dismantled them. Would she take it as victory? Would she start cutting across again, smug in her conquest? The thought twisted my stomach into knots. Because if she did, I knew I might just lose my mind all over again. For now, though, I whispered to the night, it's time. And in the silence, my lawn seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The decision to dismantle the mines came easier in theory than in practice. On paper, it was simple: sneak outside, under cover of night, dig up each device, empty the powder into trash bags, patch the grass, and pretend none of it ever happened. In reality, the act felt like burying a piece of myself, or rather unburying the petty brilliance that had given me my brief moment of glory. Still, the choice was made. Pride had dragged me into this absurd battle, but liability, bureaucracy, and the quiet exhaustion of carrying a neighborhood feud on my shoulders pushed me back out. So, one humid evening when porch lights flickered off and cicadas filled the silence, I armed myself with a trowel, gloves, and a contractor bag. The moon cast enough light for me to see the diagonal, faint but unmistakable, the scar Karen had cut into my yard for months. I crouched by the first lump in the sod and began to dig. The sound was soft, almost intimate, the scrape of metal against soil, the small gasp as the pressure plate emerged, still dusted with faint traces of pink. For a moment I hesitated. The memory of Karen's shriek, her multicolored leggings, her furious retreat, it all flooded back, warm and satisfying. I almost wanted to leave it buried, a landmine of justice waiting for its next trespasser. But the echo of the HOA's threats and the city's letter about underground utilities pulled me back to reality. With a sigh, I pried the device loose, cracked open the lid, and dumped the powder into the bag. One by one, I exhumed the rest. Blue lime, orange violet, each puff of residue catching in the night air like the last gasp of a dying prank. My gloves turned into a painter's palette. By the time I finished, the contractor bag was heavy with color, and the diagonal looked freshly tilled raw patches betraying the hidden war that had once lived there. I tamped the sod flat brushed dirt across the seams and stood back. The lawn looked wounded but alive, as though it had just undergone surgery. Back inside, I washed my hands until the water ran clear, then sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. I typed out a carefully worded email to Brenda, CCing both my lawyer and hers. Dear Brenda, as of this evening, the experimental soil sensors have been removed. The discoloration of the soil is temporary and will fade naturally. No hazardous materials remain. I trust this resolves the matter. I read it twice, making sure the words admitted nothing but suggested everything. Then I hit send and leaned back, the weight on my chest loosening slightly. The HOA responded 2 days later, surprisingly conciliatory. They agreed to waive most of the fines provided I signed a written assurance that no further unapproved subsurface devices would be installed. It was legalese for "don't bury anything weird in your lawn again," I signed. Better to surrender in paperwork than in court. Karen's reaction was less formal. The morning after the removal, I caught her standing at the edge of my lawn visor, tilted like a general inspecting conquered land. She eyed the patches of disturbed sod and smirked. She didn't say anything, but the expression was enough. She believed she had won. My fists clenched, but I said nothing. Pride urged me to shout, to remind her she'd been humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. But I swallowed the words. Let her think what she wanted. The truth was, in the silence between us, she no longer dared cross the diagonal. Weeks passed. The grass began to knit itself back together, the scar fading with every sunrise. Neighbors slowly found new gossip. A family dispute over recycling bins. A teenager caught sneaking out the eternal argument about pool hours. My exploding lawn receded into legend, spoken of with chuckles at barbecues, but no longer the headline of Pleasant View Heights. Karen, however, never forgot. She no longer cut across my lawn, true, but she also never acknowledged me again. No wave, no forced smile, just icy silence whenever our paths crossed. Some might call that a loss, the destruction of neighborly civility. To me, it was a victory. Silence was better than trespass. And yet the story had one final twist. A month after dismantling the mines, I noticed streaks of neon orange on the fur of Mr. Thompson's tabby cat. Apparently during cleanup, I'd missed a patch of spilled powder that had settled into the grass. The cat rolled in it, paraded through the cul-de-sac, and became the neighborhood's newest attraction. Children squealed, calling it Rainbow Kitty. Thompson himself laughed it off, declaring his pet the most fashionable feline in Pleasant View Heights. Karen predictably was less amused. She pointed at the cat from across the street, shouting, "SEE, he's still contaminating the neighborhood." Nobody listened. The spectacle of Karen shouting about a neon cat only deepened her reputation as the community's crank. For once, I didn't even need to defend myself. The absurdity spoke louder than I ever could. Looking back, the whole saga feels surreal. Was it petty? Absolutely. Was it costly? Between supplies, lawyer fees, and stress, without a doubt. But was it effective? Karen hasn't set foot on my lawn since. Sometimes, when reason fails and boundaries are trampled, creativity becomes the only weapon left. Mine happened to be dipped in neon. I've learned something, though. Revenge, even harmless revenge, is never free. It costs time, peace of mind, sometimes money. It leaves scars on lawns, on reputations, on relationships. But it also teaches, and what I learned is simple: you can't control other people's entitlement, but you can control how far you'll let it walk across your life. So here's my advice. Pick your battles, but if you must fight, make sure the story ends with you standing on your own porch, smiling quietly while the person who underestimated you limps home covered in powder. Just don't forget to clean up afterward. Because in the end, dignity isn't about never being crossed. It's about how creatively you make people regret it. This story might sound ridiculous, and in truth it is, but hidden beneath the neon clouds is a real lesson. Boundaries matter. Whether it's your lawn, your time, or your peace of mind, people will always test limits if they think they can get away with it. Politeness has its place, but so does firmness. You don't need landmines or explosions of powder to enforce your boundaries, but you do need the courage to say, "This far, no further." And here's the other truth. Revenge is sweet, but short-lived. What lasts is the knowledge that you stood your ground, however messy the battle. So ask yourself what's worth defending in your life, and how creative are you willing to get to protect it? If you've ever had a neighbor, coworker, or even family member cross a line, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe because trust me, there are plenty more HOA sagas where this one came from.